I remember back when I published The Great Bondian Identity Crisis in January of 2020, worrying that I had jumped the gun a bit on a James Bond video, given No Time to Die wasn't scheduled to release for another 3 months. Little did I know just how premature my essay would be, with COVID determined to keep 007 off movie screens for seemingly eternity. But now, it's September of 2021, and provided I upload this video on time, No Time to Die will have its world premiere tonight at the Royal Albert Hall, before opening worldwide in a little over a week. I have no idea how the movie will turn out, but frankly, I'm so happy to see James back, I may well shed tears just seeing the gun barrel on the big screen again. At least if it's in the right place. Of course, throughout No Time to Die's many delays, I've released a whole collection of 007-themed video essays, each in its own way exploring the series' identity and how it has changed with time. I'm very proud of this little quadrilogy, and I think it gets to the core of my perspective on Bond. But there's still one last thing to be said, and that is a complete series ranking, from worst to best, and that's what we're here to do today. This video isn't an essay, most of it's not even scripted, it's just an excuse to let my hair down and have some fun with fellow Bond fans. And to that end, I hope to see your own lists in the comments. 2 quick disclaimers. 1, I'm putting this list together before No Time to Die's release, so it's obviously not going to be a part of this list. And 2, I'm only looking at the official films in the series, so bizarre offshoots like Never Say Never Again or Feldman's Casino Royale won't be included. So, from Dr. No to Spectre, here is Eyebrow Cinema's official James Bond ranking. 24. Quantum of Solace. If you've been following my Bond videos, this shouldn't be surprising at all. I've spent a lot of time talking about why I don't like this movie and why I consider it the worst of the series, so I won't belabor my points here. Suffice it to say though, I think this is a just miserable and joyless film experience with terrible action scenes and boring villains. It's a film completely lacking in adventurous spirit, and for all its posturing as a supposedly serious political thriller, any actual critique is laughably shallow. Not a fan at all. 23. Diamonds Are Forever. This is another Bond movie I've talked about a lot in my video essays, and I think it's pretty clear how I feel about it. It's a boring, drab, ugly movie, completely lacking in any sense of romance or adventure or intrigue, and it just makes bafflingly strange choices. And I can see the desire to push a little bit away from Majesty and a little bit more towards the Goldfinger end of the spectrum, but the filmmakers pushed so far into that they ended up making a full-on farce, and in most respects it's probably worse than Quantum of Solace, but there are a handful of elements that I actually do find really strong here. Namely the music. I love Shirley Bassey's theme song, I love John Barry's score, and the elevator fight scene, as I mentioned previously, is pretty good. 22. The Man with the Golden Gun. Oh boy, the early 70s were not very kind to James Bond. What is there to say about this movie? On paper, it should work. James Bond versus the world's greatest assassin sounds like a fun premise for a Bond movie, and Christopher Lee, to his credit, is pretty entertaining and fun in this movie.
You see, Mr. Bond, I always thought I liked animals, and I discovered that I like killing people even more.
But almost nothing else about the film works. The main issue, I think, is one of tone. The film feels torn between being a movie that's trying to keep up with the more hardened and cold-blooded heroes of the 1970s, but then it also is this really goofy and silly comedy film. Everything has to be played off as a joke. Even the amazing car stunt with the car flipping midair has to have a side whistle sound effect because nothing can be taken seriously. The film also spots arguably the worst portrayal of a woman in any James Bond movie with Mary Goodnight, which is saying something for this series. It's really unpleasant to watch, and the character is written with just zero dignity or respect, and most of that is just played for laughs. And the movie on the whole is just not very exciting or entertaining. A complete waste of a good premise, because this should have worked. 21. Die Another Day. This is the last of the Bond films in the list that I would call bad, and I can already tell that to some Bond fans I've already ranked this film way too high. Die Another Day is often cited as the absolute worst Bond movie, and it's easy to see why. It's a very dumb film. Elements of the filmmaking are horribly dated and embarrassing, and were even in 2002. The villain's RoboCop suit at the end with the electricity powers is lame as hell. The cross-racial surgery, Bond's invisible car, you could go on and on and on listing all the things people don't like about this movie, and there's a lot there. And no, I don't think the film is good. But I can't quite hate on it either. I find there's something so earnest in how dumb this one is, in a way that's fun, where other Bond films are unpleasant in their stupidity. This one I find kind of endearing. Part of that is the 40th anniversary celebration of the whole thing. The whole film is littered with references to every other Bond movie, and it's very indulgent and shallow and superficial and just wallowing in the series past. But if you go into it with the right mindset of the film was like a Where's Waldo of Bond history, I'm not going to act like there's not entertainment there. It's kind of fun. Plus the sword fight scene is genuinely pretty awesome. 20, A View to a Kill. This is Roger Moore's last outing as 007, and one that often is remembered as being one of the bad ones, and that's not totally fair. This movie actually has a lot going for it. There are a handful of really strong action scenes. Christopher Walken and Grace Jones just make a fascinating combination of villains, and Walken gets some fun line deliveries in there.
But that means I would have to be
dead.
There are two main things that drag it down. One is the pacing is really off. It kind of feels like the movie's story keeps restarting almost, and so the movie feels a lot longer than it really is. And the other and more obvious issue is Roger Moore looks like he's 800 years old. He kind of looks alright in long shots, but as soon as you get a close-up, he looks just... ooh, it's not okay. He's far too old to be in this role, both for the action scenes and certainly for the romantic love scenes. But the movie's not as bad as its reputation would suggest. It's more just kind of below average. 19, Octopussy. From Roger Moore's last film to his second last film. There's not too much to say about this Bond movie. I described it in my Never Say Never Again video as kind of the most middling of the series, and I stand by that. The action scenes are pretty good generally, but none of them are really exceptional. The villains are functional, but they're pretty stock. It's on the whole just like a very bland kind of James Bond adventure. The one element that does kind of stand out to me is Maud Adams, because while not like all that close in age to Roger Moore, she feels older and more mature than a lot of the leads in Bond films do, and that gives their relationship a little bit more of an air of sophistication that I do find interesting. 18, Moonraker. Moonraker is often cited as one of the bad James Bond movies, but I've come around to kinda liking it. Obviously, James Bond Goes to Space is very silly, but once you kind of accept that most of these movies are cartoons anyway, the stupidity of that seems a lot less egregious and offensive, and you can just kind of embrace it for what it is. And while it is kind of lame that James Bond is so transparently just trying to ape on the success of Star Wars, I also find it kind of interesting to watch the filmmakers try and translate science fiction action into the James Bond aesthetic. Film also has great music from John Barry and another awesome Shirley Bassey theme song. This is probably the least famous of the theme songs she did, and it's probably the weakest of the three, but it's still really good. The two things that hold the film back are at times the pacing can be rather slow, and it also is really a bummer that Jaws becomes a comical punchline in this movie, and so much of his character is just played for cheap laughs. But overall, I think this film is actually more fun than it gets credit for, and is an interesting piece of Bond history. 17, The World Is Not Enough. This film is tricky to rank because most Bond films tend to be sort of veering towards the middle. This one is kind of existing at different extremes at the same time. Because on the one hand, Sophie Marceau is great in the film as Elektra. I love her performance, and the way that her character is just a lot more complex and interesting and has more layers than a lot of villains or love interests in these movies do, and the way she functions as both is really interesting. And I respect that the film wants to make a more personal, hard-hitting story. It's not just another adventure. This one is actually hitting close to home a bit and is trying to address character, and yet the film just doesn't totally work. The action scenes are just kind of not as exciting as they should be. Renard as a villain who can't feel pain seems interesting on paper, but doesn't actually amount to much. Denise Richards as Christmas Jones. Denise Richards gets a lot of flack for this performance. I don't really think it's warranted, but this character does feel like an afterthought, and like she's only there so Bond can be in bed with somebody at the end of the movie, because obviously it's not gonna work out with Elektra. I don't know, it feels like a movie it's like two Bond movies. One is a fairly mediocre Pierce Brosnan James Bond movie, and the other is a bit more ambitious and is trying to be more of a character piece. And I respect that, and I want to like this movie more than I do, but it doesn't totally work. That said, it definitely has its moments. That opening action scene is a lot of fun. Sophie Marceau rocks. Judi Dench gets some really good stuff to do. It's certainly not a complete waste, but it's definitely a trickier one to rank in the grand scheme of things.
You're not retiring anytime soon, are you?
16, Skyfall. Okay, this is another Bond movie I've talked about a lot before, but I probably need to say more still, because I'm sure the fact that I'm ranking the film this low probably looks insane to most people, even though 16 is a fairly respectable ranking. So, Skyfall. I've talked before about how part of my issue with the film is principally that its central premise just doesn't work for me. The film very much positions James Bond as a potentially over-the-hill agent and is asking, can James Bond still go? Is he still worthwhile, or has his time come? And it's very clear, transparently, obviously clear that it's a metaphor for the series as a whole. Does this series still have relevance in the 21st century? Do these movies still matter to people? Is this series worth continuing? And it frustrates me that this is the story for two reasons. One, diegetically it makes no sense. Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace were all about James Bond as hotshot young new agent who was out of control and needed to be disciplined and learn the ropes, and now all of a sudden he's an over-the-hill agent whose time has come. It feels like we've missed like 5 adventures in between Quantum and this, so that doesn't really work for me. More importantly though, I find that the thematic questioning of the series' relevance is a complete waste. Is this series still relevant? Yes. James Bond has always been popular since Dr. No. Every single film in the series has made money. Even when they've been underperforming, they still gross well over their budgets. And the series was on kind of a hot streak. Quantum wasn't as successful as Casino Royale critically, but it still made a lot of money. Casino Royale was a massive hit and also probably the most well-reviewed Bond film ever, the first one to get serious accolades and awards consideration. And even before that, all of the Pierce Brosnan films were big successes. Every single one of the Pierce Brosnan movies grossed more than the last one, to the point that Tomorrow Never Dies opened the same day as Titanic, and it still made a ton of money. So this notion that the series has had its back against the wall for all this time and is an underdog that needs to prove itself is nonsense. It doesn't make sense. And what frustrates me is this film gets a lot of credit for being introspective and critical of the series, but it really isn't, because if it was, it would actually address things about the series that are problems and have been historically. It would be a film that would question, say, the inherent sexism and misogyny of the James Bond movies, or the layers of racism and white supremacy or pro-colonialism messages in these films. And it doesn't do that, and it doesn't do that because it can't take those themes and turn it around into being a slam dunk about how awesome James Bond is. And fair enough, I'm not sure I want a James Bond movie to tackle those issues that bluntly either, but I don't think this one deserves all that credit for being the introspective, thoughtful James Bond movie when it's actually setting itself up for an easy win. And beyond all that, and my sort of annoyance at its thematic smugness, I also just find narratively the film is torn between wanting to be this sort of brooding James Bond story where, the character faces hard times and has to deal with failure and loss, but also the film wants to be this aspirational and awesome action movie where Bond returns with triumphant awe. So it's a movie where Bond fails at everything for 2.5 hours and then has the gall to end with like, 007, are you ready to get back to work? With pleasure, M. And it's like, you didn't do anything right this entire movie. You didn't retrieve the lists at the beginning, you didn't pass your training tests, you caught Silva, but that was just part of his plan, and you couldn't save Saravine, you couldn't save M, like you didn't succeed at a single task in this movie. So for it to turn around and have this sort of badass and awesome return to form ending, while it's kind of satisfying in the moment the first time you see it, it's ultimately pretty hollow, and the more I see this film, the more it just stands out as like this total disconnect from the story that precedes it. And yet saying that, I still like this movie clearly because it's ranked above a lot of other Bond films I've had positive things to say about. I think that Javier Bardem's performance as Silva is really fun to watch and mesmerizing, one of the most memorable Bond villain performances. The action scenes across the board are really strong. The film is generally made with a lot of slickness and skill. It's a film that does a lot right, and I get why people rank it as highly as they do. But the closer I look at it, the more I see just like gaping holes and flaws and problems that I really can't ignore. 15. You Only Live Twice. This movie's pretty hard to defend in a lot of ways. Sean Connery is noticeably bored and less enthused to be here than in the prior entries, and yet I'm still ranking it pretty highly, and there's a few simple reasons for that. One, the film is shot by Freddie Young, who was the cinematographer for David Lean on movies like Lawrence of Arabia, and while You Only Live Twice doesn't look, that good, I do think the sense of widescreen composition and just the bigness of his visual style does translate, and there's some really interesting ways of photographing action scenes. And speaking of action scenes, the real reason this movie is as high as it is, despite its many flaws, is the way it comes together at the end. The siege on Blofeld's hollowed-out volcano lair involving ninjas rappelling in with machine guns is just fun. It's so outlandish and silly, but it's so entertaining and so exciting. And speaking of Blofeld, I rather like his on-camera introduction. Donald Pleasance, I think, is creepy and sinister. I love the scar. I love the sort of detached and vaguely horror-esque way he delivers dialogue. So ultimately, it's a movie that kind of redeems itself in the latter half, and it's probably one that I'm giving a lot of leeway to, because it certainly has misgivings. I haven't even mentioned the section of the film where James Bond is turned Japanese, which is like bizarrely racist and uncomfortable, and also from a strictly storytelling perspective, totally boring and pointless. There's no reason for that to happen. It just fills up time. But that ending and the Ken Adam production design, I love the look of the set too, is just so exciting that the movie ends up working for me when it matters most. So definitely a questionable entry, but I feel comfortable putting it here.
This is the price of failure, Mr. Bond.
14. Spectre. So I'm sure some people probably think it's just absurd that I would rank this above Skyfall, and not just by one slot, but two, and they probably have a point. There's a lot of stuff in this film that's really questionable. I'm not going to defend making Blofeld Bond's long-lost evil stepbrother. That's just bafflingly stupid and transparently a desperate effort to make Blofeld the ultimate James Bond villain without really earning it in the story. And yet, in spite of that, I find this film really works for me. And I think what it really comes down to is that it's the only of the Craig-era films that feels comfortable just being a James Bond movie. It doesn't have to reboot the series, it doesn't have to try and be this edgy political thriller, even though it has nothing of substance to say. It doesn't feel like it needs to make meta-commentary on Bond's relevance in a modern action movie landscape. It can just be an action-adventure movie with a mystery, with some good set pieces, and with a decent little romance. I really like Hoyt van Hoytma's cinematography. I know Deakins' work got all the attention with Skyfall, but I like that with Spectre, Hoytma's work it's less showy, it's less indulgent in just showing you pretty images, but I find it in its own way just as good. 13. Live and Let Die. I've mentioned earlier in this list that early 70s was not a good time for James Bond, and that does show in this film. It certainly feels smaller scale and less extravagant and ambitious. Cribbing blaxploitation as a genre makes sense when one considers how popular those movies were and how generally adrift the producers were with James Bond at this point, but it does lead to some issues. Principally is that the film is made by a bunch of white British men who have no sense of understanding of the Harlem communities they depict on film, and what you get is pretty racially insensitive. I wouldn't call it outright bigotry, but it's very clear that the film is being made by people who don't really understand what they're depicting. And there's also just some really ludicrous scenes, and yet it's hard to hate on a movie where Yaphet Kotto plays the bad guy. And that's kind of a big part of why I like this movie. I really, really like Yaphet Kotto's performance as Kananga, aka Mr. Big. The man is just so naturally compelling on screen and has such great charisma and is a really sort of intimidating force. And in general, the film has a whole circle of interesting side villains who don't have a ton of character per se, but have a lot of like personality in their look and their presence on screen. And I think the other thing that works really well about this movie is quite simply Roger Moore. You know, it's easy to give Moore a lot of flack. His films leaned into goofy comedy, and it's also, his run of James Bond is probably the most formulaic and kind of stale by the end. But at the same time, Roger Moore is the reason the series still exists today. Because as much as I love On Her Majesty's Secret Service and George Lazenby, and a lot of people do now, the film was not well received at the time, and Lazenby was not accepted as James Bond. So the notion that the series could survive, that James Bond could exist without Sean Connery, was not yet proven. Live and Let Die is what proved it. The film wasn't like the biggest Bond hit, but it was big enough to justify continuing with the series, and I think on screen Moore just projects confidence and makes his character feel immediately distinct from Lazenby and from Connery. And I think that seals the deal for the film. It's messy and really imperfect, but as an adventure, I think it works decently well, and the elements that need to resonate the best do. 12. License to Kill. On paper, this film is a pretty overt effort to try and shake the formula up. Bond is suspended from MI6 and strikes out as a rogue agent. His mission is a lot more personal. He's going after somebody not for Queen and Country, but out of a sense of revenge and loyalty for his friend Felix Leiter. And his plan involves infiltrating the villain's circle and turning him against his own men. For John Glenn, the director of 80s Bonds, it was a chance to really distinguish what he was doing and make a different type of Bond movie. It doesn't really translate in practice. It mostly just feels like another 80s Bond with a little bit more of a nasty edge. But it still works, I think, because overall it's just a pretty solid action movie. I really like Dalton's take on the character. I like that he manages to have a sort of brooding edge without making it putting too fine a point on it. It's just kind of a subtle layer to the way he portrays the character. I think that the action scenes have real teeth in this movie, and there's generally a sense of threat and menace. Most importantly, though, the film features a young Benicio del Toro as one of the villain's henchmen, and my man is great here.
Don't worry. We gave her a nice honeymoon.
I feel like even if Benicio didn't go on to become one of the best actors of his generation, I would still love his performance here, because the dude's genuinely pretty chilling. 11. Tomorrow Never Dies. Would it be fair to say this movie is a little underrated? I feel like the Brosnan movies have largely been thrown under the bus in recent years, as sort of retrospectively seen as not very good, other than GoldenEye, but I think this is a really solid Bond adventure. None of its elements are like truly exceptional, but most of it is pretty darn good. The action scenes are generally a lot of fun and exciting. The film's got a good pace. Wei Lin is pretty awesome as the Bond girl. I mean, it's Michelle Yeoh, and sure, the fight choreography and the action scenes maybe don't do her talents total justice, but it's still pretty cool to see her kick ass in a Bond movie, and I think it's pretty entertaining. Jonathan Pryce is totally hammy as the film's villain and not particularly menacing, but he's really fun to watch. I don't know, it's a really solid Bond adventure. In some ways, it's the true face of the James Bond series, which is not especially exceptional, but generally pretty good. The film also has its own weird little unique bits, and in particular I'm thinking about the scene between Bond and Dr. Kaufman, who is an assassin that specializes in making his kills look like accidents, things like overdoses. It's this weird scene that's like tense and a little bit chilling and uncomfortable, but also with this undercurrent of dark humor, and Vincent Schiavelli's performance is neat and just really different for a Bond villain or henchman. There aren't too many other characters in the series that really look like this guy, or scenes that look quite like this. Number 10, The Living Daylights. The main reason I rank this Bond film as highly as to make the top 10 is because I just really like Timothy Dalton as James Bond. The fact that he has this background in Shakespeare and theater acting, I'm not going to say colors the character too much directly, but you can feel in his performance a certain conviction and commitment to the role that, you really feel he's taking this seriously. And I also like that while his Bond is harder edged and a bit more jagged, he's not like a totally cold, inhuman, brooding character. There are moments of sensitivity between Bond and Kara that I think really resonate, and while the relationship here is not necessarily aspiring to be a Bond and Tracy or a Bond and Vesper level of romance, it does feel a lot more romantic than a lot of the relationships in these movies tend to be. I also think John Glenn does a good job shifting his style to match Dalton. The film generally has a bit of a darker look and has more of a tone of a sincere Cold War thriller than the more comic book light comedies that he'd been making with more towards the end of their run together. The movie also has a really underrated Bond theme, I think. You know, the idea of a-ha doing a James Bond song sounds like laughable, but the song itself is actually pretty cool and kind of rocks. Number 9, Thunderball. This really comes at a time when Bond is at the height of his cultural powers, and that does show on screen. There's a certain effortless cool to the production. I love, as I've talked about in my Terrence Young video, the way that Young blends Goldfinger's sense of spectacle with his own more restrained, more rooted in tangible realities. I really like the layers of sympathy and sensitivity that are found in Bond and Domino's relationship, and the film has not one but two really strong villains. Emile Largo is the more memorable, number 2, the eye patch, very iconic. But the real star here is Fiona Volpe, who is, in her own stealthy way, one of the best villains in all of Bond. She's crazy sexy and alluring, but also dangerous and smart, and can cut Bond down like that. And I love the way that she uses sex against him in a way that I find really refreshing and fun. And I just love the way that she commands the screen. It's an awesome performance and an awesome character. The movie also has a fantastic theme song and was also the first to really nail the opening credits, I think. Number 8, For Your Eyes Only. This was John Glenn's first Bond movie, and it's interesting because if you were to just watch it, you would not predict that he would become the director of very standard, samey Bond films that leaned more towards comedy, because this one really doesn't. The opening of the film and the ending have big comedic bits to them, but this is also a film that the very first shot is James visiting the grave of his wife, and the story is defined by having more tangible emotional stakes. Bond gets more personally involved in the story. Melina Havelock is openly out for revenge and is out to kill the person who killed her parents. And the film also plays with the formula in interesting ways. The fact that one of the standard Bond tropes is Bond arrives on location and he's met with a contact who aids him through the story, and usually end of the second act into the third act, that contact dies and it heightens the stakes. And this Bond film, the initial contact that Bond has, that guy turns out to be the villain. And taken on its own, it's not necessarily the craziest twist, but in the context of this series, it is a pretty deliberate swerve of expectations, and I actually really like Christados as a character. Julian Glover's performance ends up being really strong in how he makes that transition too, because when you first meet him, he feels like decent and normal enough that he makes sense as just a contact, but the way he evolves into playing an out-and-out villain by the end feels really natural. So yeah, overall this movie is really strong and a testament to Roger Moore being a more versatile Bond than he gets credit for. Number 7, GoldenEye. GoldenEye was famously the reintroduction to the series after a 6-year break and was the first Bond outing for Pierce Brosnan. And I like Brosnan here a lot, and I like the way Campbell reintroduces the series. The film has a much more cool look. The tone that's very sort of reflective of the end of the Cold War bleeds into its visual style, and Campbell's sense of action filmmaking feels much more modern than John Glenn's. And yet what stands out to me the most about this film is actually kind of none of those things. It's really Sean Bean, who is one of the best Bond villains in the series. And some of that comes down to the writing, the way that the character is a former friend and ally of James who's grown bitter and disillusioned and has broken off from MI6 and become an enemy. And Sean Bean really sells it. He's so compelling to the point that even when the writing starts to become a little bit muddied, where it's not totally clear if Alec Trevelyan is acting out of personal motivations or revenge, or for more standard Bond villain, I want to be rich and rule the world type motivations. But Sean Bean is just so good and committed and compelling that it kind of doesn't matter. You just go with it. And then the Bond girls in this film are wonderful as well. Natalia, I think, is one of the most intelligently written and competent female characters to occur across the series. And of course, Femke Jensen as Xena Onatopp is hilariously over the top and wonderful in a way that feels really perfect for this series. And Femke Jensen is just having so much fun on screen, and it's wonderful to watch her.
Wait for your turn.
Number 6, The Spy Who Loved Me. Easily Roger Moore's masterpiece in the Bond era, this is just a wickedly entertaining spectacle. It's awesome action scene after awesome action scene, with wonderful bits of character interaction and humor sprinkled throughout. Jaws is a fantastic henchman. The set design of the underwater bases by Ken Adam is amazing. Anya Anisova is also one of the most compelling Bond girls in the series. The way that, especially the first act of the film is constructed with her and Bond kind of continually one-upping each other, almost plays to me like a screwball comedy in the early sort of courtship back and forth of characters, which is built on a certain antagonism. If there's one element holding the film back from being top 5, it's the villain. I don't hate Stromberg exactly, he's perfectly fine, but he's just kind of the stock evil James Bond villain, the rich guy who wants to do a bad thing. There's not really much of a relationship between he and Bond, or he and Anya for that matter, so he works just fine. The final confrontation between he and Bond is pretty entertaining, but he's certainly not my favorite, and that really distinguishes this entry from my number 5, Goldfinger. For better or worse, this is the Bond film that really defined what the series is. The tone of the movies, the pacing, the look, the feel of James Bond, it's Goldfinger. This is the one that set the template. This movie does a lot right. It has a wonderful balance of humor that Guy Hamilton would never achieve in the series again, where it is very funny and you can have a lot of fun with it. But there is also, the tension of the story is taken just seriously enough that it still works as an action movie. The film also has an amazing theme song, a number of very fun and creative action scenes, and most importantly, a fantastic villain. More than Blofeld, the defining villain of the series, the most iconic. And he's not a physical threat to James really at all. They're not like a Batman and Joker yin and yang type thing. And Goldfinger's scheme is not even the most evil or horrific thing we've seen in a Bond movie. You know, basically he just wants to make himself a lot richer. And yeah, he's willing to kill a lot of people to do that, but he's not out to conquer the world or commit some type of genocide. He just wants to make himself a little bit richer. On paper, not the defining most ultimate evil the series has ever seen. And yet he resonates as the defining villain because the movie is so good at articulating his relationship with Bond that every time James takes something away from Goldfinger, Goldfinger hits him back so hard that it shatters James completely. It's Bond at his most macho and powerful, and yet also not. But of course, there is one massive blight to this film that I really can't ignore, which is the ideological repositioning of Pussy Galore, which is essentially a rape scene. It is an extraordinarily uncomfortable sequence, and in fact, the more I rewatch Goldfinger, the more this scene makes me just squirm in my seat. Which is a shame because it's a blight on what is otherwise an almost flawless James Bond adventure. It does everything else so well that for it to fumble in that area is so disappointing. Number 4, Dr. No. The Bond film that started it all, and one that I think is easy to take for granted in some ways today. It certainly has a slower pace than we're used to from the series. A lot of the iconic elements are still, they're there, but they're still finding their footing and still growing. And I also think there are some just general missteps. The final confrontation between Bond and Dr. No is a little bit anticlimactic. And it's always bothered me that the 3 blind mice are set up so strongly in the beginning as these formidable assassins, and then the payoff to them is they just kind of drive off a cliff after a car chase with Bond. I always felt like we should have something more to that story, but at the same time, I can't help but rank this film really highly. Part of that is I like the detectiveness of the story. I like that it's this real investigation, and a lot of it is allowed to play out slowly as Bond slowly unravels this sinister conspiracy and mystery. Part of it is I quite like Joseph Wiseman's performance as Dr. No. There are obviously problematic layers to this actor playing a Asian supervillain, but I really like his scene with Bond in particular at the dinner table. The dialogue they have is a lot of fun, and I like the sort of cutting barbs they throw back at one another.
Unfortunately, I misjudged you. You are just a stupid policeman.
But really, there's one main reason that Dr. No ranks this highly, and it's Sean Connery. Because wow, first kick at the can, the man is already just effortlessly cool, so compelling, so absorbing on screen, so indubitably and immediately an iconic screen hero. Within seconds, you totally buy it and feel it. It's the reason the series endures, is because of that actor with that character, and I think it comes off beautifully, even the first film in. Number 3, Casino Royale. Much as I might have pretty mixed feelings overall on the Daniel Craig era of Bond and the way it positions itself in relation to the rest of the series, much as a full-on reboot of James Bond was probably unnecessary, Casino Royale is still pretty awesome. It definitely helps that for the first time in a long time, the producers had a Ian Fleming novel they could directly adapt to the screen, because this is one of the best stories of any James Bond film. It's one of the few films where you actually see James change over the course of the story. As an action movie, the film also excels. Like GoldenEye, we have Martin Campbell in the director's chair, and I think this is his best work as a director. The action scenes aren't only thrilling and technically brilliantly executed, but they're also really strong pieces of character. Mads Mikkelsen's Le Chiffre, I think, is an awesome villain. I think he fits perfectly as a more realistic version of villainy in the 21st century, and yet he still has enough of a sort of theatrical sense about him in Mikkelsen's performance, but also in the makeup and the visual of the character, that he still feels like a proper Bondian villain. The film also has just a murderer's row of great talent in the cast. Eva Green, Jeffrey Wright as Felix Leiter, easily the best Felix across any of these movies. Felix has always just been like sort of a reliable James Bond buddy, but here he's actually just really cool and slick in his own right. And Giancarlo Gianni as Mathis, who is one of the most memorable Bond contacts in any of the movies. And I think that as much as Craig gets a lot of credit for like being this serious and, you know, somber and gritty Bond, and like he is to an extent, I think this film is also full of humor and moments of lightness that make it an all-around satisfying blockbuster entertainment. So much as I might rue the influence this film ultimately had on where Bond would go for the next 15 years, I can't really deny how special the movie itself is to me. Okay, now we come to the top 2, and I have to make a choice. A choice between a Bond film that I've loved for as long as I can remember and has usually been my favorite for most of my life, and another Bond movie that I didn't always like very much, but over time has grown substantially in my estimation, and in the last few years in particular has really resonated with me in ways that I never expected. I'm not sure I'm totally ready to make a call between these two films, but I promised you guys a list, I gotta deliver. Number 2, From Russia with Love. In a lot of ways, this is my platonic ideal of a James Bond movie. At once a serious Cold War espionage thriller, and also a silly comic book style adventure action film where a super spy fights off against a secret cohort of evil bad guys trying to control the world. And I think the film hits just like a perfect balance in terms of the tone, where there's just enough of a heightened sense of theatricality and silliness to give it a certain escapism and charm and fun, and yet the action is just hard-hitting enough to carry real impact. And I think a lot of that is really rooted in the performances. I mentioned the sort of covert layer of like evil villains, and you got with Rosa Klebb and Red Grant and Kronstein and whatnot, and they are pretty silly when you really step back and look at them, but none of the actors are playing it with any sort of winking irony. They're there and they're committing and they take it seriously. And Klebb and Grant in particular really resonate as these intimidating bad guys. The scene between Grant and Bond in the train car is one of my favorite scenes in all of Bond, even before the fight scene, which is excellent and kind of shockingly violent in terms of just how like desperate a struggle for survival it is. But also the fact that we've seen Grant built up throughout this movie and striking from the shadows and sort of hanging over the narrative, and now finally this is the first time he's really speaking as himself, and they have this conversation, and I love the weight that it carries and the way the two men play off each other. Young feels in complete control of his craft. The action is sharp, impactful, and exciting. And even at the end, when film kind of lets up a bit on the serious spy thriller aspects and just indulges in spectacle, the scenes are really well executed. Kevin Bacon is also one of the most likable and affable people in any of these movies. It's hard really to describe what it is about this character, but there's something about him that's so sweet and good-natured. Like, every time I go back to this movie, seeing him is one of the best delights of it.
I've had a particularly fascinating life. Would you like to hear about it? You would?
In many ways, a perfect James Bond movie, and was my number one for a long time. But not anymore. Number one, On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I mean, it had to be, right? Like, after the last video, after all I said about it being the end of James Bond and the culmination of Bond style, both aesthetically and as character growth, and how it basically brought the series to a point that it never really recovered from or knew how to handle, and yet has continually haunted over the series. Like, how could this not be my number one? You know, I think it's a testament to this film that I said all I did about it in that video, and it was a long video, and I still had things I didn't talk about at all. Like Telly Savalas as Blofeld. The best portrayal of the character, in my opinion. I love how smooth and calm and dapper and kind of charming he is. He's not creepy like Donald Pleasance, but he feels more like an aristocratic equal and peer to Bond. One of my favorite scenes is when Blofeld's goons are taking Bond to his little makeshift prison cell, and Bond tries to escape and starts fighting them, and Blofeld doesn't even flinch. He's in complete control and Bond's not getting away, that he doesn't even move, and then just immediately starts smugly rubbing it in. It's fantastic. Also, the music. Again, I had a hard time finding a place to talk about this in my last video organically, but oh my god, John Barry's score is probably the best in all of Bond. It is so good, so rich and vibrant and romantic and exciting, and certain scenes, like just the buildup of the music, is all you need to get you excited. And I could go on and on listing the amazing things about the film. Tracy and Diana Rigg's amazing performance, the fantastic action scenes, the performance of Gabrielle Frazzetti, who I just learned fairly recently also played Morton in Once Upon a Time in the West, which I had no idea. There's so many excellent things about this movie, but overall the main thing I keep coming back to is it as the embodiment not just of who James Bond is, but what James Bond can be, what the character can be, what the movies can be. You know, Peter Hunt was the editor initially on this series. His work did so much to define the look and feel and tone and pacing of James Bond, and it's so clear in every scene that he really takes this seriously. He believes in this character and this world, and it means a lot to him. You feel that love and enthusiasm for this character in this world, and it really is infectious. To me, the real shame is that Hunt didn't live long enough to see just how acclaimed his Bond film would be. By the time he passed away, the tide on the film had certainly started to shift. Its reputation was starting to sway, but I don't think he fully grasped just how revered and acclaimed the film would come to be. And that's too bad, because he deserved it. So there you have it, my ranking of all 24 James Bond movies. Did you hate it? I hope not. I had a lot of fun talking about these movies, and I hope you did too. Agree or disagree, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, how you'd rank the Bond films, what your favorites are, what your least favorites are. If you have unexpected ones in either directions, either really acclaimed Bond movies you don't like at all, or kind of dismissed Bond films that you actually think are pretty good, I would love to hear them. In case it's not clear from the many essays I've made over the years on this character, I love these movies, and I don't know if I'll be doing anything Bond-related again for quite some time, but these were a lot of fun, and I'm really grateful for you all for coming along with me for the journey. So thank you. And thank you to my patrons who make these kinds of videos possible. If you like what I do and you want to support me, you can go to patreon.com/eyebrowcinema. Perks include early access to videos, voting on video topics, weekly updates on the work I do, and what you're seeing now, names in the credits. So thank you, and have a lovely day.